Webinar we're going to be starting now. I'm Margo Pedroso with the Safe Routes to School National Partnership, and I'll be talking today about the new federal transportation law, the FAST Act, and the impact on Safe Routes to School. And prepare yourself to get used to my voice because I'm the speaker, the moderator, and the question taker, so you'll be hearing a lot from me today. So first about us, the National Partnership is a nonprofit organization that improves the quality of life for kids and communities by promoting active, healthy lifestyles and safe infrastructure that supports biking and walking. And equity is at the forefront of our work. We're a network of more than 700 organizations, agencies, businesses, and schools working to support the development and implementation of Safe Routes to School policies and programs throughout the United States. And we encourage you to become one of those partner affiliates. And Molly will put a link to how you can join as a partner affiliate in the message box on the right. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items on how GoToWebinar works. So on the left is the GoToWebinar viewer through which you're seeing this presentation. And to the right is the GoToWebinar control panel where you can raise your hand, ask questions, and select your audio mode. The attendee control panel will collapse automatically when not in use. To keep it open, you can click on the View menu at the top and uncheck Auto Hide Control Panel. In terms of your audio controls, you have two options to listen over a telephone if you dial in, or over your computer's mic and speakers. And if you're having sound problems with one option, please try the other. If you're getting feedback, please make sure that you have the appropriate option selected. If you've got telephone selected and mic and speakers, you might hear it from both ends. And we'll do our best to field any issues. Just send a chat message. And then when you have a question, please feel free to submit those. I'm going to take questions at the end, but you can go ahead and type them in as you have them. And you'll see there is a questions box on your control panel on the right. Everyone on the phone line is muted, so we're only taking questions typed into the chat box. And this is really intended to be an informative webinar that includes a really good portion for question and answer. I'm going to try to keep my presentation to the first half hour, leaving a lot of time for questions and answers about the law or how it's working or not working in your community. This is also where Molly will post links to anything that I reference where there is a hyperlink that you can follow. And after the webinar is over, we will post it on our website so that you can watch it again or pass it along to others. And you click on the resources button in the top of our website, which is saferoutespartnership.org. And then on the left, you'll see webinars. And then the most recent webinars will be listed there for you to view. Okay, and with that, the housekeeping is complete, and I will move on to the content for today. I already introduced myself, but I'm the Deputy Director with the Safe Routes to School National Partnership, and one of my responsibilities is to handle our work on Capitol Hill to advocate for Safe Routes to School biking and walking funding and policies with Congress and with the administration. So I'm really glad to be here today to tell you about what just happened in December when Congress passed the new transportation bill and how it will impact Safe Routes to School. So the FAST Act was just passed in December, as I mentioned. It is the successor to the last transportation bill, MAP 21, which you may have heard of. MAP 21 was passed in 2012 and was originally a 2-year bill ending in September 2014. However, Congress was not able to get a new bill done by September 2014, so they ended up extending MAP 21 for 15 additional months. And the major barrier, which has frankly been the major barrier all along, was funding. The federal gas tax that funds transportation is no longer sufficient to cover the entire cost of transportation at the federal level. And in fact, it's about $15 billion of a shortfall. So Congress didn't want to increase the gas tax. They had a hard time figuring out where to find that kind of money. So it took them 15 months to create the FAST Act. FAST stands for Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act. And as I mentioned, it passed in December 2015, so just a month ago. And it's a $305 billion bill that covers fiscal years 2016 through 2020, so that's a 5-year period. And rather than raising the gas tax or finding some other long-term solution, they used effectively accounting gimmicks to cover that shortfall. So they kind of cobbled together money from under the couch cushions and other funding sources that actually are not related to transportation to cover the money to allow the bill to pass. They did build in a trigger, however, so if Congress does actually pass a gas tax increase or some other revenue generating law, the trigger would actually increase all of the programs within the FAST Act proportionately. And this is one of the few pieces of legislation that got truly bipartisan support. So I'm going to focus mostly today on the Transportation Alternatives Program, which is a key source of funding for Safe Routes to School. Then I will also touch on a few other funding sources as well as some policy items that were included in the FAST Act. So for the Transportation Alternatives Program, or TAP as we call it, it was originally created in MAP 21, the last transportation bill, by merging together three key programs for funding and biking and walking, which were Safe Routes to School, Transportation Enhancements, and Recreational Trails. And the FAST Act sustains the TAP program without many changes, and in this very conservative Congress, that's actually a victory. And I think most important is that we now have 5 years of certainty for TAP. We know the program exists, we know the funding levels, and really there are no excuses for states and MPOs not to be implementing this program. When you see a program created and only a couple of years of funding, states may wait and see what happens. We've got 5 more years of funding on top of the 3 that have already happened through MAP 21, and states should be well into running application processes. One of the changes in the FAST Act is that it moved the TAP program to be part of the Surface Transportation Program. This is a key funding stream for federal dollars that goes to states and to regional authorities, the Metropolitan Planning Organizations, or MPOs. So it's not an independent program anymore, but honestly, it doesn't have any effect on how the program operates. They also renamed it to the STP set-aside. So the STP stands for that Surface Transportation Program. But even though it's renamed at the federal level, there's no requirement that it be renamed at the state and local level, so you may continue to see states use the TAP name. And as I said, there's really no effective change in the core ways that TAP functions. So the same types of projects are eligible. There was no change at all there, and you'll see those in the box on the right in the orange. So you'll see that Safe Routes to School, infrastructure, and non-infrastructure continues to be eligible, along with all of the other items that were previously eligible. It still requires a competitive process, and to us, this is one of the most important aspects of TAP. You know, states and MPOs have to hold a competition, and you get a chance to say, here are the projects that, you know, our community needs, and make your best case for those projects. And it still does require a state or local match, and it's 20% in most states. There are a few states where the match is lower. In terms of funding levels, there are a couple of tweaks here. First, we did secure a small increase over the life of the bill. It's about 4%. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a victory to have the funding increase throughout the life of the bill. When you're stuck at one funding level for the entire 5 years, it makes it much harder the next go around to appeal for an increase. And so now we're showing that, yes, this program should increase over time, just like other transportation programs. So in 2015, the last year of MAP 21, it was funded at $819 million a year. And that's increasing for 2016 and 2017 to $835 million. And then for the final 3 years, 2018 through 2020, it will be $850 million. And then it retains the current decision-making split between state departments of transportation and the large metropolitan planning organizations. So kind of run through this chart because it is a little complicated. But in essence, the state gets their allocation for TAP. They set aside a small amount for the Recreational Trails Program, and then out of what remains, it's divided into 2 pots. Half of the money can be used anywhere in the state, so the state runs a competition for TAP projects, and they can choose projects anywhere in the state for whatever priorities they want within TAP. However, this pot of money, they can transfer out to roads or to other transportation projects. So we find in states that are less supportive of biking and walking and Safe Routes to School, they may repurpose this money. The other 50% states cannot transfer. It has to remain as part of TAP. But this funding is allocated by population. So this 50% is then divided into 3 categories. For large urban areas that have more than 200,000 people, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, or the MPO, they get an allocation of dollars appropriate for the number of people that they have, and they run the competition. They choose the projects, they set the terms and the timeline for the application, and they pick what's most important to their region. There is one change to this, which is that MPOs now have the same flexibility that states do, in that they can use 50% of their TAP money for non-TAP projects. So they could choose, for example, to fund a road project. We don't think that this is going to be very likely for two reasons. First is that these projects still have to go through a competitive process for them to select them. And secondly, the MPOs don't get enough money to actually fund large projects like that. The amount of money they get really does work for these smaller biking and walking and safe routes to school programs. So this is in here. We're going to need to keep an eye on it and make sure that MPOs are fully spending their TAP money. But we don't think it will be that big of a harm to the program. The other chunk of the money for the smaller communities, those that are under 5,000 population and those that are between 5,000 and 200,000, the state runs that competition as well. So they hold a competition, they choose the projects. What most states do is they put together the anywhere in the state money and the 5,000 to 200,000 money and run one competition. They just make sure that when they choose projects, they represent the population areas appropriately. So there are a few other tweaks to the Transportation Alternatives Program. First is that nonprofits that work on transportation safety are now eligible to directly compete for TAP projects. This is an important win, particularly for Safe Routes to School. Nonprofits used to be eligible under the old Safe Routes to School program, and then they were stripped out of the eligibility when TAP was created in the last transportation bill. This has created problems, particularly for Safe Routes to School, because a lot of biking and walking organizations were getting funded by the state departments of transportation to do bicycle and pedestrian education or to do route planning and things like that at multiple schools throughout the state. When they were not eligible directly, they were having to find different ways to be funded through other projects as partners. Now nonprofits can apply directly, so it'll make it easier to ensure that that funding continues to flow. There's also more transparency. So states and metropolitan planning organizations must report some data on the applications and the selected projects. So they need to report the types of applications and projects they're getting, the funding level, and a little other information. So this is going to help make sure that states and MPOs are implementing the program, what kinds of interest there is out there for TAP projects, and that will help us both for making sure that the money is being used well, and also to make sure that when we go to Congress for the next transportation bill, that we've got good data to share with them. There's also a possible future solution for regulatory burden in that TAP projects are treated currently as if they're highway projects, even though in almost all cases they are not highway projects. We're putting in sidewalks along existing roads and those sorts of things. But because of how the legislative language is written, they have to go through all of the hoops that a highway project would. So that provision unfortunately remains, but the U.S. Department of Transportation is required to look across all programs, including TAP, and they have to issue new guidance to identify ways to speed up project delivery. They do have a year to do this, so we'll be working with the U.S. Department of Transportation about our recommendations about how to improve the process for TAP. But we are hopeful that in the future we'll be able to move these projects more quickly. Okay, so let's move on to other funding streams. And just a reminder, I'm going to handle all the questions at the end. I do see that some of those are coming in. So other funding streams in the FAST Act. First and foremost, just as always, all of the other major federal transportation funding streams, like the Surface Transportation Program, CMAQ, which is the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality, they can still fund biking and walking infrastructure. So it's still eligible. And so the Surface Transportation Program now specifically lists Safe Routes to School as an eligible use of funding. We were already eligible before as bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, but it's really helpful to have it listed specifically. So states have other funding streams that they could choose to fund these projects with. They don't only have to be funded through the Transportation Alternatives Program. Secondly is a program called TIFIA. You may not have heard of it. It's not a grant program, it's a loan program. What it offers is low interest loans to help local governments finance mega projects. And it's not something that's really been used for Safe Routes to School in the past because it's always had a project minimum of $50 million, which is a lot of money. They did in the transportation bill drop that to $10 million, and you're allowed to bundle projects together that are similar. So theoretically, your local government could choose to bundle together a bunch of sidewalks, bike paths, trails, and actually get a loan for that. However, as it's a loan, they have to pay it back. So it's not the same as a grant. It may not be something that your local governments use, but I wanted to make sure you're aware of it. Another program is TIGER. This is a competitive program run by the U.S. Department of Transportation. It's a national program, so people compete from all around the country. This is actually not something that was done in the FAST Act. It's funded on a year-to-year basis by Congress through the annual appropriations or the funding process. But I did want to make sure you're aware of it. Congress completed the appropriations process, within a week of when they finished the FAST Act, and they elected to fund TIGER for $500 million for 2016. So we're likely to see another competition there. A couple of other funding streams to make you aware of. The Highway Safety Improvement Program, or HSIP, that is the primary federal funding source for safety, as the name would imply. It can still fund bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, but there is a change in that non-infrastructure is no longer eligible. So education, encouragement, that type of stuff cannot be funded out of HSIP. It was not a major source for this, but it is a limitation to the program. There are other funding sources available for non-infrastructure. For Safe Routes to School, that can be funded out of the TAP program. And then it can also be funded out of something called 402 program, which is run by a different part of the U.S. Department of Transportation. It's run in your state by the governor's highway safety offices. To offset that loss, there is a new national priority safety program specifically focused on bicycle and pedestrian safety that was created in the FAST Act. One thing that we really like about it is that it says that bicycle and pedestrian safety is a national concern and should be focused on. And what it does is it takes 5% of the National Priority Safety Program, which comes out to about $14 million, and it makes it available to states where more than 15% of the traffic deaths are bicyclists and pedestrians. Right now, that's about 20 states. That will, of course, vary from year to year depending on the fatality statistics. And the states that choose to take the money will be able to use it on increasing awareness of bicycle and pedestrian safety laws through law enforcement trainings, through enforcement campaigns for drivers, through education and awareness campaigns. The governor's highway safety offices that I mentioned just a minute ago are the ones who would likely control this funding. However, we do not know yet when this program will actually be created and be accessible. We're working with the U.S. Department of Transportation to understand when they'll give states the guidance on how to access the dollars. So stay tuned for that. So in terms of policy, there are some provisions in the FAST Act that help create a good environment for Safe Routes to School. So the FAST Act includes some complete streets provisions. And these aren't as strong as we would like them to be, but they're a really good step forward. So states and metropolitan planning organizations are encouraged to set design standards or policies that address safety for all users. And it applies to all federally funded projects, and it's all aspects of the federally funded project, all the way from planning to construction. And the U.S. Department of Transportation is required to provide best practices about these policies and also report in 2 years on implementation. So even though it's not a requirement, having this in the law and having an encouragement, we hope will allow more states to come on board with complete streets policies. There's also more design options for local governments. And this may be more detailed than most of you want to know, but there are guides that basically say what types of designs that you can use when you're building your infrastructure. And the traditional one that a lot of states refer to is put out by AASHTO, which is the State Highway Officials Organization. And it's not as progressive as another design guide that's put out by NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials. Their guide takes into account a lot of the newest ideas on how to design bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. But if your state doesn't recognize it, it means that you can't implement those designs locally, in effect. So the FAST Act included a provision allowing local governments to adopt the NACTO guide and to use its designs, even if the state DOT doesn't, but only for funding that they're receiving directly. So that would be something like Tiger funding. Okay, so I've kind of given you the overview of what's in the FAST Act specific to Safe Routes to School biking and walking. So I wanted to just spend a little bit on what's next. And you might think, okay, we've got 5 years of funding, I'm all set, I can just focus on my local program. But I really want to encourage you that now is the time for advocates like you to really look into how your state and your MPO are using TAP and to advocate for changes if you don't think it's sufficiently serving Safe Routes to School or that they aren't moving quickly enough. So a couple of places for you to go. First, I encourage you to go to saferoutespartnership.org. In the Healthy Communities section, under Advancing Policy Change, there is our federal policy section. New information gets posted frequently in the federal policy page, and there is a section called FAST Act Background and Resources, where I compile a lot of the resources that kind of provide important background for you on the FAST Act. So it's got the legislative history of Safe Routes to School, the changes that were made by the FAST Act and by MAP 21, has funding allocations. I need to update those with the new numbers once they come out, but it still gives you an idea of how much money your state will get. It has implementation models and profiles of how states and MPOs are using TAP, and blogs that are particularly relevant, explaining the local match, how to message Safe Routes to School and things like that will be posted there. So it's a good reference place. And Molly has posted a link directly to that section. So when you're looking at your state, we do have some resources that can help you keep tabs on how and when your state is implementing the Transportation Alternatives Program. And the most important one is probably the least fun to look at. We issue a quarterly State of the States, and it's a giant Excel chart that we put out in PDF. And what we do every quarter is we look at what each state is doing for implementation of TAP. So we look at how much money they have for TAP, whether or not they've transferred any money out to roads and bridges. And you'll see on the right here in the green box, this is the states that have transferred TAP money to other uses, along with what percentage of TAP. And you'll recall they can transfer up to 50%. So you'll see there are some states in there that are fully transferring out their money that definitely need to be kept an eye on, and other states that have transferred smaller amounts. Right? We also track obligation rates, which is basically money that has actually been spent for projects. And it's a good proxy to understand whether or not the state has awarded the money and is actually making it available in a timely fashion. We also track Safe Routes to School awards, although this one is the most challenging one to track because not all states are clearly identifying which TAP projects are Safe Routes to School. But overall, even though there are some limitations in the data, it lets you see which states are moving forward and which aren't. And so I would encourage you to get in the habit of looking at that each quarter to see what kind of progress your state is making. And this is something that we highlight each month in our e-news, or each quarter in our e-newsletter. You can also go to your state's TAP webpage to look at the funding history. And Molly included a link to the Federal Highway website where you can look up your state contact and click to go to the website. So I encourage you to look at, is there an application process? Have Safe Routes to School projects been funded? And if you're not seeing any movement in your state, or you're seeing that Safe Routes projects are not competing well, I encourage you to work with others in your state to recommend changes to either the application or the scoring process. And this is something I'd be happy to help you with if you want to get in touch with me. And then coming in March, we will be issuing a new report card that assesses the state progress in implementing physical activity policies. And one of the key areas we'll be assessing states on is their implementation of TAP. So I'm in the process now of reviewing every state's progress on TAP, and so we'll have a lot more information coming in March. So when we look at MPOs, there are a couple of resources to be helpful as well. And so again, for MPOs, this is only going to apply to those of you that live in larger cities where your region has more than 200,000 people. Those are the only MPOs that actually get funding through TAP. However, there are about 200 MPOs nationwide, and they get about $200 million of TAP each year collectively. So this is a decent chunk of change. So if you're in one of those regions, we encourage you to take a look at our resources specific to MPOs. That FAST Act background page that I showed you a couple of slides ago, one of the things that's linked there is a publication we put out last fall in partnership with the National Center for Safe Routes to School about how MPOs are advancing safe routes to school through TAP, and we profile 4 really excellent MPO approaches to this. I think they give a really good model for you to think about educating your own MPO about. Before you go to them, I encourage you to get to know your MPO, understand their priorities, and really think about how safe tool fits into those regional priorities, whether it be for safety, for traffic reduction or congestion management, for health, and make sure you understand how they're implementing TAP and think about what kinds of recommendations you would make if you find that Safe Routes to School projects are not getting funded. So with that, we're going to move on to the Q&A period, and I want to ask for your patience because I'm reviewing the questions, answering the questions, and all of that, so there may be pauses as I get through the questions and read them out to you and respond to them. So, and this is a good reminder for you to go ahead and submit questions if you have not already. All right, so give me a second here and let me get to the top of our question list. So one question is about whether or not the money is available for off-road biking and hiking trails, as well as bike lanes or shared lanes on existing streets. And this money is pretty flexible. The TAP money itself is available for all types of bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure on-road and off-road. As well as for off-road, the Recreational Trails Program can fund that type of infrastructure as well. And most states administer the Recreational Trails Program separately from the Transportation Alternatives Program. It's often run by a different agency other than the State Department of Transportation. But again, that can be applied for through TAP as well. Okay, so then the next question is, why can half of these funds go to non-TAP projects? So this is basically the compromise that got agreed to in MAP 21, the last transportation bill. There was a lot of pressure to eliminate these projects altogether. There were a lot of members of Congress that didn't want to fund biking and walking at all. They thought it wasn't an appropriate use of federal dollars. And so they tried to eliminate it altogether. So one of the compromises was that we're going to have a funding source for it, but we're going to give states flexibility to use half the money on other purposes if they have other priorities. So that's why states are allowed to transfer up to 50% of their TAP money to other sources. I will say, though, that this is something that actually ended up working in our favor, ironically, when we went to Capitol Hill, because the list that I showed you of the box, the green box of which states have transferred funding, altogether across all states, only about 10% of TAP money has been transferred out by states. And so what we've been able to do is go to Congress and say, look, you thought that states didn't want this money. You thought they were going to transfer a lot of money. Only 10% is getting transferred. Clearly, most states value this. So it turned out to be an advantage for us, but it is really difficult if you're in one of the states that is, unfortunately transferring out that 50%. All right, so let me look here. The next question is, where do we find out how much money is allocated to our state and county? On the FAST Act resources page, there is an estimate of how much your state will get. However, I have not yet updated those for the new funding level under the FAST Act. If you look at the funding allocation for your state and you add maybe 2% to it, that'll give you an estimate of how much money comes to your state. Counties themselves don't actually get a funding allocation. It would only go to the Metropolitan Planning Organization if you're in a large area. you're in a small rural area, there's money set aside for all small rural areas, but not for specific counties. So as soon as we have the funding allocations available from USDOT, I will put those into our next newsletter. If you have specific questions, you can always email me and I can try to get the right answer for you sooner. Okay, the next question, do nonprofits have to match 20%? Yes, although there are exceptions. For the federal law, all types of projects, regardless of who the eligible applicant is, all projects have to have a 20% match. Federal dollars can only provide 80% of the project cost. And so the exceptions would be that in some Western states, there is a different matching scheme allowed, basically due to the fact that they have a lot of federal lands, they can't collect taxes, so one of the benefits that they get is a lower match. So we see in some states the match requirement might only be 5, 10, 15%. For most states it is 20%. The other exception is that there are a few states that have been able to find resources to make the match using state dollars rather than requiring locals like you to make the match. So for example, New Jersey and Ohio, those are examples of states that use state resources to make the match. So there are some cases where you won't have to find a match, but in most states you would. Next question, how does a nonprofit compete? Do we still have to apply through a municipality or through an MPO? Basically, nonprofits are now eligible for the TAP program. They don't just have to partner with someone else. So when a TAP competition comes out, assuming your state chooses to make nonprofits eligible, because it's still their discretion, you would be able to apply for TAP just like anyone else. So whatever the application process is, if you are in a large urban area, you could apply through your MPO, or otherwise you could apply through your state. But you have to wait for your state or your MPO to open an application process. Okay, next question. Does that mean that nonprofit program administration costs can be funded? I would say this is the type of thing that really is going to depend on your state and how they set up their application process and what types of things are eligible. But in general, overhead, some types of administration costs are generally eligible as long as they're related to the implementation of the project or the program that's getting funded. They won't let you generally build in, all sorts of other expenses, but a staff person that's, running a Safe Routes to School program could be funded, those types of things. Okay, we have a couple questions on the same question, which is, where can we find a list of the 20 states that are eligible for the National Priority Safety Program, which, if you'll recall, was the new program for bicycle and pedestrian safety. I don't actually have that list yet because it's not clear to me which year they will use as the qualification period, whether it's going to be 2014 or 2015. So I think it will depend on when the U.S. Department of Transportation issues kind of the guidance or the rules and what year they use as the cutoff point. However, if you, I will actually submit as part of the follow-up to the webinar a place where you can go to find the bicycle and pedestrian statistics so you can get a sense of whether you are well above the 15% cutoff, below, or kind of right on the cusp. And if you're on the cusp, it's something that's going to depend on which year's data they're using. So let me just make a note of that. Okay. Okay, moving on. We did have a question about what does it mean to transfer funds. So in essence, what that means is a state is told, here's the amount of money you have for the Transportation Alternatives Program, but you can take 50% of it and use it for something else. And so what a state can choose to do is say, okay, I'm going to take $1 million of TAP money and I'm going to move it to a new funding program, for example, the Surface Transportation Program. And then I'm going to be able to lump it together with all of my other road and bridge money to fund other priorities that I have. And when a state transfers money away, it is no longer TAP money, so it doesn't have to be competitive, so they can use it for whatever the state priorities are. Okay, let me see here. All right, another question. When will MPO areas under $200,000 or under 200,000 population have an idea of how much money they will have access to with an approved project? So if you are located in an MPO area that has less than 200,000 people, there is no set aside for that MPO. It is simply a competitive process. There are categories of money, so a chunk of money will be set aside for everyone that's in an area with less than 200,000 people, but it is a competitive process. So there's no guarantee you will get funding. It's not as if it's allocated to each and every area. It's a competition. Okay, does the new bill fund any non-infrastructure work under the Transportation Alternatives Program? So non-infrastructure for adults is not allowed under the Transportation Alternatives Program. So, biking and walking education or campaigns for adults is not allowed. The only type of non-infrastructure that is allowable under TAP is specific to Safe Routes to School. So non-infrastructure programs, education, encouragement, all of that stuff is only allowable for grades K through 8 as part of a Safe Routes to School program. Okay, can a nonprofit apply independently or must we partner with the city? You no longer have to partner as long as your state chooses to follow along with the federal changes and make a nonprofit eligible. So nonprofits will be allowed to apply directly. I think that makes sense for non-infrastructure. For infrastructure projects, it's pretty important that you do work with your local government because they're the ones that's going to have the authority to do the infrastructure improvements. Okay, how do we find out when the state MPO will open the application process? And we also have a similar question about where do we find the criteria and the deadlines for applying. This is something that really does differ from state to state and from MPO to MPO, and there's no one place that you can go to sign up for information about it. So what I would encourage you to do is, Molly has up there a Federal Highway link to find out the contact in your state for the Transportation Alternatives Program. They also have a website. See if there's a way to sign up for an announcement on that website for when funding is made available. They may also, some states actually have a set time frame. So, they may take applications, every July 1st, for example. And again, every state has their own criteria, their own timelines, that sort of thing. And for your MPO, if you were in one of those MPOs with more than 200,000 people, I encourage you to reach out to your MPO. There may be information on the website, or you may have to get in touch with the staff person to find out their process and their timeline. Okay, next question. Will Safe Routes to School state coordinators remain optional? Yes, state coordinators are no longer required, but they are allowed to be funded using TAP money. So if states want to continue them and need help with the staffing costs, they can access TAP dollars to do that. But unfortunately, they are still not required. Okay, hold on here. So my understanding is that TIFIA is typically used for toll roads in order to pay back the loan. Would there be examples of when TIFIA would be a good option for sidewalks, et cetera? So if you'll recall, TIFIA was the loan financing program where they just dropped the minimum project size from $50 million to $10 million. And it is correct that in order to secure a TIFIA loan, you have to have a financing source to kind of secure the loan to show that you've got a way to pay it back, which is why a lot of TIFIA does get used for toll roads, because they can show, here's the money I'm going to collect, and I'll use that money to pay back the loan. There are some efforts being done to use, in essence, property value increases, tax increases that could be generated by infrastructure improving the area to qualify for that. So for example, a bicycle and pedestrian network, you could try to apply on those grounds. It is kind of a new area, and I think it needs some work in order to be all that effective, but I believe there are jurisdictions that are using something along those lines. Okay, local governments like to use any source possible to meet the 20% matching requirements. Are there any match source limitations, other federal or state money rather than local? In general, the matching cannot come from other federal dollars. I believe there are a couple of exceptions, which I don't know off the top of my head, only very specific federal funding streams. But other than those exceptions, federal dollars do not count as a match. But pretty much any state or local source can be used as a match other than that restriction. Okay, let's see. If a state is not using TAP funds to support Safe Routes to School, do you have to follow the TAP guidelines? So the way this works is the federal legislation is basically the outside parameters of what's permissible, but states can actually restrict it within those federal parameters if they choose to. So a state can't choose to fund projects that aren't eligible for TAP, but they could choose to narrow down TAP if they wanted to only fund certain kinds of projects. We have some states that are creating one application program for Safe Routes to School projects and one application program for everything else. We have some states that are setting different priorities each year, that we may, prioritize certain types of projects this year, certain types of projects in future years. So as long as a state is within the bounds of what's permissible for the federal statute, that's allowed. However, I think for advocates can take a look at what is the state choosing to fund, and is that what makes sense for them, and try to make the case to encourage the state to make changes. Okay, so let's see. All right, we had a clarification question on the nonprofits. I had indicated that the non-infrastructure funding is only for grades K through 8, and so could a nonprofit propose an education encouragement campaign affecting high schools? And that would not actually be allowed. The Safe Routes to School program just covers K through 8. There is now a Safe Routes for non-drivers provision within TAP that could fund infrastructure around high schools, but it cannot fund non-infrastructure. So non-infrastructure is only for grades K through 8. Okay, we had a question about schools. Are schools considered nonprofits for Safe Routes to School applications? Generally, no, schools would not be nonprofits, but schools are eligible on their own. All types of school entities, so school districts, local schools, as well as all aspects of local governments were already eligible for TAP, and so they continue to be eligible. It's just that nonprofits are newly eligible. And again, we had a question on Safe Routes to School in K through 8, which I think I've answered already. And we did have somebody who answered the question about the 20 states with more than 15% fatalities. So I will just read those off for you. I take this with a grain of salt because the source is coming from Tool Design Group, and again, we don't quite know what year USDOT will use as the qualifying point, but here are the states that, whatever year this is from, I'm not sure if this is 2013 or 2014 data, that had more than 15% fatalities. So as I read these off, note if you're in there, this would mean that your state would possibly be eligible for the new program for bicycle and pedestrian safety. Oh, there we go. Molly just put it in your chat box so I don't have to read it out to you. So look to the right to see that list. Okay, here. We have a question about adequate planning. Does a project have to be part of a plan adopted by the MPO? I'm not sure I exactly understand the question, but any project that's ultimately approved for transportation alternatives funding does have to ultimately be included in the state and local planning documentation, but that's something that can be added after a project is approved. So if whoever submitted that question, if you want to follow up with me separately over email, I'm happy to engage in that a little further. I will say also that states and MPOs can set their own requirements. For example, in order to apply for a Safe Routes to School project, they could require you to have a travel plan, for example. Let's see. Do you have resources for us to advocate with our state DOT to keep funding in Safe Routes to School? I'm in Oklahoma, where 50% is being transferred out. Well, I'm sorry for anyone in Oklahoma, as well as the other states that are transferring out the 50%. I'd be happy to work with you directly on this. I think in cases like this, the best way to do it is to think about either a media campaign or a legislator's campaign to apply pressure to the DOT to consider not transferring dollars. I will say you have an uphill climb in Oklahoma, but I would say in addition to them transferring out the 50%, they also have not actually run an application process yet for the other 50% that they have. So what that means is that in Oklahoma, only the major cities like Oklahoma City are being able to move forward with their TAP money, and everybody else in the state is getting left out. So I think a campaign to pressure the DOT to actually use the money that they have would be great. And then a second step would be to try to decrease the transfers once you've shown there's a lot of need for the program. And again, I encourage you to reach out to me directly. Okay. If an MPO is a nonprofit, could they apply for funds? I believe the answer to this is no, although it's a little bit of a sticky wicket or interpretation issue. MPOs and state departments of transportation are specifically excluded from applying for TAP money. The reason being is that they're the decision makers on how the funds are used, and thus they should not be able to compete as well, because then they might pick their own projects. So I believe the prohibition on MPOs and states applying would override whether or not they're a nonprofit. Okay, are pre-K eligible for Safe Routes to School and TAP funds? Technically, the answer to this is no. The federal legislation sets out K through 8 only. However, if you had a pre-K facility that also included, K and grades 1, for example, you would be able to apply. And there was a similar question about high schools. Would a grade 7 through 12 school become ineligible? And I believe because it includes grades 7 and 8, you could then apply for dollars. But these are the types of things that might depend on your state's interpretations. Let's see. Okay, hold on. Let me scroll back up to the top here and start through again. Can school districts apply if they do not have a master agreement? I think this might be something that is a more specific state-based question. So I am not sure of the answer to this one, but you can go ahead and email me directly, and I'll see if I can find the answer to you based on what state you're in. Okay, let's see. Our community already has bike lanes in place within a 7-mile radius of our school. However, many students or families do not ride or walk to schools due to lack of road supervision. Does TAP fund schools to cover for personnel for safety road monitoring? So there's kind of a it depends answer to this one, which is TAP, for example, cannot fund crossing guards themselves, but it can fund training and materials for crossing guards. So if you're able to get volunteer crossing guards, you could help provide them equipment and training. It can also fund enforcement, so it could help your local police provide better coverage around your school. So those would be the 2 ways in which it would be able to help fund that sort of thing. It can also fund a coordinator, Safe Routes to School coordinator at your school to help engage volunteers that might be able to lead walking school buses or bike trains that could help provide support to the students as they're on the trip to school. So there are kind of ways to do it, but in terms of just hiring a whole raft of people to monitor the roads, that would likely be difficult to do under TAP. Okay, someone asked if I could scroll back to the graph that showed the breakout of the TAP funds. So let me do that quickly. Okay, that should be on your screen there, and I'll leave that there for a minute while I move on to the next question. Let's see. It's our understanding that TAP funding can be used for pre-K and high school routes, just not Safe Routes to School. So this is where the difference comes between infrastructure and non-infrastructure. For infrastructure, Safe Routes to School infrastructure is only K through 8, but there is an eligibility in TAP that covers a wide array of things that's called Safe Routes for non-drivers. And so that could cover infrastructure improvements around all sorts of facilities, including high schools, pre-K schools. However, for the education component, that is only eligible for Safe Routes to School, and thus only would apply to grades K through 8. I realize that's confusing. Hopefully I've clarified that enough. By when is the USDOT expected to issue new guidance to help speed up the process of getting projects funded? That's something that USDOT, that was the regulatory burden piece that I talked about, if you'll recall. They have a deadline of a year from now to issue that guidance. I will tell you that unfortunately a lot of times the agencies do not actually meet the deadlines in the legislation. But we will be talking with USDOT, and we hope that it would be something that would be issued by December. Once it's issued next December, it may take states a little bit of time to kind of understand it and start to use it. So it is something that's definitely down the road in the future, but we're hopeful that we will eventually have some improvements in how long it takes to do these projects. Question about whether or not the funding will help fund bike racks in school districts. Bike racks are an eligible use of funding within Safe Routes to School. So yes, if you're able to do an application and compete, you would be able to fund bike racks as part of your plan. Let's see. We had a question about whether or not Florida is supposed to be on the state transfer of TAP funding. Let me see if I can find that slide. Sorry, I'm flipping through these slides. It's probably terrible for you guys. Let's see. Florida is not on the list. This list is pulled directly from the Federal Highway Database that tracks transfers. So Florida has not transferred any money out of the Transportation Alternatives Program. You might be thinking about the Recreational Trails Program, which Florida has quote unquote opted out of, meaning that they don't set aside recreational trails money out of TAP. They instead make it all available to the TAP program. Okay, let's see. Is the flexible transfer to STP 50% of the statewide 50% or all of the statewide 50%? Okay, so I'm going to go back to that chart. Again, sorry for flipping around on these slides, but a visual is always helpful for this. When you look at this chart, the 50% for anywhere in the state, that entire 50% is what states can transfer out. So out of, let's say your state gets $10 million for TAP, and they set aside a small amount for recreational trails, 50% of that $10 million is able to be transferred out to other uses. Will we have access to your PowerPoint? Oh, sorry, Molly answered that, but yes, we will post an archive on our site by Friday of the deck as well as a link to the webinar. Okay, we have a couple more questions about bike racks. We're getting close to end of time, so if you do any questions, go ahead and pop those in, and I'll try to get as many of them as I can before the end. Where can we apply for bike racks, and would bike racks only be eligible for infrastructure funding, or could we do an infrastructure and education project together in the same application? So bike racks, just like everything else, you would apply through your state or your MPO's Transportation Alternatives Program application process. And it's up to your state to set the criteria. Whether or not they'd let you apply just for bike racks, whether you would need to apply as part of a larger project is going to depend on your state. And again, you know, some states do separate applications for non-infrastructure as they do for infrastructure. Some have a combined application. So depending on your state, you might be able to apply for the non-infrastructure and the bike racks together. For others, you might have to do separate applications. So again, it depends on your jurisdiction. Okay, last question that I have in the queue right now is whether or not you can use a TIFIA loan as a match for a grant. That is a good question, and I do not 100% know the answer to that. I would suspect that the answer is no, though, because the TIFIA loan is federal dollars in origin, and in general, federal dollars cannot be used as a match for transportation alternatives or other federal transportation projects, but I don't know for sure. So I will look into that and see if I can find an answer to that if the questioner wants to email me directly. Okay, I have actually gotten through all of the questions, I believe, so we'll give you just another minute if you have any other questions that you want to add, and meanwhile, I will scroll to the kind of closing aspects of the PowerPoint here. Okay. All right, so we will move on here. You will see, there we go. Again, I just wanted to remind you where this webinar and the related materials will be posted. If you go to SafeRoutesPartnership.org, the resources section, webinars, is where we post all of our past webinars. So by Friday close of business, we will have this recording for you to access as well as the PowerPoint slides. And again, I encourage you, if you have additional questions or I told you to get in touch with me, please feel free to do so. We also have, oh, sorry, we had a few late breaking questions come in. So let me answer those really quickly since we've got a minute. In Tennessee, I was told that only the highest level of school district could apply for funds. You've said that even local schools can apply. Is this an example of where the state can apply an additional restriction compared to the federal legislation? And yes, that's exactly the case. Under the federal law, all levels of schools can apply, but your state could choose to restrict that further and only allow school districts, for example, to apply. And then a final question about bike racks. Are bike racks non-infrastructure or infrastructure? Is it up to the state to decide? I believe that bike racks are considered infrastructure under the federal statute, not non-infrastructure. But it's something that I will have to double check on. Okay, we have finished the questions, so final closing. Encourage you to take our survey. You will get a survey emailed to you after the close of the webinar. It's very quick and short, asking for your feedback on the webinar, which we appreciate. We always want to make these better. And finally, I want to thank you. Look forward to working with you over the coming 5 years as we get this money out for Safe Routes to School. Thank you, everyone.